Recently, the US government got out of the longest shutdown in its history. The shutdown dragged on for so long because the American president wanted to hold federal workers hostage to use them as bargaining chips to build his wall. This is a wall that most Americans don't want, which would be exorbitantly expensive, especially to maintain in perpetuity, and which has been described by other policymakers as a medieval tool that's not even effective in the first place. I've talked about the wall before, in a previous news segment where I explained how building such a hellacious thing would disrupt and threaten 6 large wildlife reserves and protected areas, including a butterfly sanctuary that's also home to an endangered species of bat. It would also disrupt the migration patterns and the ecological relationships of species that cross the US-Mexico border, because you have to remember that wildlife, animals and plants and fungus and everything like that, by and large, they don't really recognize or care about political borders. Much like the wall, this recent shutdown was also needlessly harmful and destructive, except unlike the wall, the shutdown actually happened. The FDA went unfunded, so produce wasn't being checked for safety. Thank goodness the USDA was still being funded, so at least our meat was still being checked, but the FDA shutting down was just a foolish and reckless roll of the dice for a big E. coli outbreak. Federal workers across numerous departments were furloughed, and as the shutdown dragged on, their savings began to get eaten up because they're not getting paid and their bills are still coming in. And keep in mind that most of these people weren't living high on the hog in the first place. A lot of these federal workers make modest wages, so a 5-week lapse in payment threatened many families with food insecurity, and some even risked losing their homes. The president might think that this is a game, he's just bargaining, it's just business. But he's putting people's lives and livelihoods at risk, and it's cruel and irresponsible. Now perhaps the longest lasting damage, and what I want to talk to you about today, was what was done to the national parks. Normally, the national parks are staffed and patrolled by park rangers, and tour guides, and service staff. But during the shutdown, many of these people weren't even allowed to come into work, while the parks themselves remained open to the public. The parks were operating with skeleton crews, and this made monitoring guests and preventing misbehavior nearly impossible. Even basic tasks like keeping the parks clean was made extremely difficult because of the shutdown. John Gardner is the senior budget director of the nonprofit National Parks Conservation Association, and in an interview that he had with the Associated Press at the start of the shutdown, he said, quote, "We're afraid that we're going to start seeing significant damage to the natural resources in the parks, and potentially to historic and other cultural artifacts. We're concerned there'll be impacts to visitor safety. It's really a nightmare scenario," unquote. Unfortunately, what Mr. Gardner feared came to pass. In national parks across the country, garbage cans overflowed with waste, and litter was scattered across otherwise healthy landscapes. People would wander off the marked trails and trample all over sensitive and delicate habitats. They would bring their dogs, who would scare away local animals like burrowing mammals or ground-nesting birds, and the dog's waste was usually left on the ground. People even came in and drove their four-wheelers around, ripping up the dirt and the low-lying vegetation and ruining the surface ecology. There were reports of people coming in at very early and very late hours, and this, combined with people wandering wherever they felt like going and using four-wheelers and other loud machinery, this led to a huge disruption for the local wildlife. For example, sheep and goats and other fauna were repelled from visiting their usual watering holes, because humans were there, making a mess and making things dangerous for them and being, just in general, inconsiderate assholes. Yosemite National Park had to close some of its campgrounds because of overflowing toilets and garbage cans. Dakota Snyder is an employee at Yosemite, and she said, quote, "It's a free-for-all. It's so heartbreaking. There is more trash and human waste and disregard for the rules than I've ever seen in my 4 years living here," unquote. Joshua Tree National Park also closed some of its campgrounds. In addition to the litter and feces and four-wheelers, people were outright abusing and damaging the Joshua trees. These elegant plants are really old, with many of them being more than 150 years old, and they're delicate too. But ignorant and inconsiderate people came in and hung up Christmas lights on them. Some people played on the branches and broke them, or ripped the branches right off the trunk. Other people went so far as to chop down some of the trees. The wood wasn't even taken. They just wanted to destroy them. This takes me to the tragic conclusion of the government shutdown. Kurt Sauer is the superintendent at Joshua Tree National Park, and he said, quote, "What's happened to our park in the last 34 days is irreparable for the next 200 to 300 years." Unquote. This is something that people don't often take into consideration, even though it's incredibly important. Damage to the ecology creates widespread, long-lasting problems, and it can take the ecology an incredibly long time to recover, if it can even recover in the first place. John Loratig used to be a ranger at Joshua Tree National Park, and now he leads the nonprofit Friends of Joshua Tree. After describing the damage that was done to the trees to reporters, he said, quote, "The local community is fed up with our parks being held hostage, and the fact that it's open and partially staffed is not good for the park. It's not good for the public, and it's not good for the local community here. If the government doesn't fund or staff the parks appropriately, then they should just close the parks to protect the parks and protect the people." Unquote. Because of Trump's flaccid and egotistical style of politics, we're likely to see another shutdown on February 15th, when negotiations over wall funding will almost inevitably meet an impasse. Hopefully, the parks will just be shut down entirely this time, so this kind of ecologically devastating and morally reprehensible behavior can be prevented.